The email arrived at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, sandwiched between a client approval request and a spam message about cryptocurrency. The subject line read, "Family meeting urgent today, 4 p.m." No explanation, no context, just my mother's digital equivalent of a summons. I should have known something was coming when my sister Jessica had been unusually present at the office for the past 2 weeks, her laughter echoing from our parents' corner office while I debugged campaign analytics and fielded client calls. But sometimes the thing that destroys your life arrives wearing the mask of routine, and you don't recognize it until it's already carved out your heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 6 years ago I thought I was building my future. Instead, I was building someone else's empire. This is the story of how my parents handed my life's work to my sister on a silver platter, and how a single paragraph buried in Employee Handbook Section 4.7 became the nuclear option they never saw coming. The conference room felt smaller than usual that Wednesday afternoon, though nothing had physically changed. Same glass walls overlooking the Pearl District, same whiteboard covered in my campaign flowcharts, same motivational poster about teamwork that my mother had hung 3 years ago. But when your parents ask you to sit down in your own workplace, the geometry of everything shifts. My father, Robert Mitchell, sat at the head of the rectangular table with the kind of rigid posture that meant business. My mother, Linda, perched beside him with her hands folded, wearing what I'd learned to recognize as her conflict-avoidance smile. And there was Jessica, my 25-year-old sister, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself. I took the chair across from them, my laptop still warm from the client presentation I'd been fine-tuning. The Portland afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the table, and for a moment, I felt like I was attending my own trial. My father cleared his throat, shuffled some papers, and delivered the verdict with the same tone he used to discuss quarterly projections. "Sarah, your mother and I have been doing some strategic planning for the future of Mitchell & Associates. We've decided it's time to bring fresh leadership into the company." He paused, glanced at Jessica, then back at me. "We're transitioning Jessica into the role of creative director and principal partner, effective immediately. She'll be taking over primary client relationships and company direction moving forward." The words hit me like cold water, each syllable precise and devastating. I sat there watching my father's mouth form the shapes of my professional execution and felt the strange disconnection that happens when reality suddenly rewrites itself. 6 years of 18-hour days, 6 years of building systems and nurturing client relationships, 6 years of turning my parents' small marketing consultancy into a legitimate agency, and it was being transferred to someone who had spent the last 2 years posting Instagram stories from European cafes. I looked at Jessica, who was studying her manicured nails like this was a routine staff meeting, then back at my parents, waiting for the explanation that would make this make sense. "Fresh leadership," I repeated, keeping my voice level. "Jessica's been back from her European adventure for 6 months. What exactly qualifies her for this position?" My mother shifted uncomfortably, but my father's expression didn't change. "Jessica brings a creative vision that our clients are responding to. She understands current market trends, social media integration, the kind of forward-thinking approach that will take us to the next level." He gestured toward a presentation folder in front of Jessica. "She's developed some innovative concepts for our Q4 strategy that, frankly, Sarah, show a level of creative thinking that we haven't seen before." I stared at the folder, recognizing the typography from the brand refresh templates I'd designed last month. Creative thinking. The phrase sat in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. I thought about the client retention system I'd spent 2 years developing, the automated reporting tools that had increased our efficiency by 40%, the relationships, I'd cultivated with business owners who specifically requested to work with me. None of that was creative thinking, apparently. That was just operations, just maintenance, just the invisible infrastructure that kept everything running while others got to focus on vision and innovation. Jessica finally looked up from her nails, offering me what she probably thought was a reassuring smile. "I know this is a big change, Sarah, but I'm really excited about the direction we can take the company. Your operational expertise will be invaluable as we expand our creative services." Operational expertise, the consolation prize, the participation trophy, the gentle pat on the head that acknowledged my usefulness while firmly establishing my place in the hierarchy. I was being demoted to supporting cast in the story I had written, and they were framing it as collaboration. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, a carefully orchestrated presentation of how this transition would benefit everyone. Jessica would handle creative strategy and client relations. I would continue managing day-to-day operations and campaign execution. The company would benefit from fresh perspective while maintaining operational stability. It was a perfect plan, they explained, that played to both our strengths. I nodded at appropriate intervals, asked clarifying questions about reporting structures and decision-making authority, and watched my parents' relief as they interpreted my professional composure as acceptance. But while they were explaining organizational charts and role definitions, I was thinking about something else entirely. I was thinking about a conversation I'd had with my college friend Elena Rodriguez 3 years ago, when she was fresh out of law school and I was paranoid about protecting the intellectual property I was developing for the company. I was thinking about Employee Handbook Section 4.7, subsection C, a seemingly innocuous paragraph about intellectual property rights that I had insisted on including during our policy update. I was thinking about the proprietary client management system that bore my digital signature in its code, the automated campaign tools that were registered under my individual developer credentials, and the detailed documentation I had meticulously maintained for every system I had built. Most of all, I was thinking about how my parents had signed off on that employee handbook without reading it, trusting their daughter to handle the tedious details of policy language while they focused on bigger picture concerns. They had no idea that their methodical, operational daughter had spent considerable time crafting legal protections that would prove very relevant to this conversation. But I wasn't ready to discuss that yet. Not until I had confirmed some details and prepared my response properly. When the meeting ended, I shook Jessica's hand and congratulated her on her new position. I hugged my parents and told them I understood their reasoning. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and opened my laptop to begin the most important research project of my career. Because while they thought they were handing over the keys to an established business, they had actually just declared war on someone who had spent 6 years documenting every detail of how that business actually functioned. The foundation of everything they were taking from me had been built with careful intention, and I had made sure to protect what I was building. They just hadn't bothered to read the fine print, but I had written it, and I remembered every word. Tomorrow, I would remind them that operational expertise sometimes includes the foresight to prepare for exactly this kind of betrayal. Tonight, I was going to reread Employee Handbook Section 4.7 and remember why I had been so insistent about including it in the first place. The details came trickling out over the following days like water through a cracked foundation, each revelation more devastating than the last. Jessica wasn't just being handed the creative director role. She was receiving 60% ownership of Mitchell and Associates, effective the 1st of next month. The company that I had systematically grown from a 2-person consultancy to a 25-employee agency was being transferred to someone who couldn't differentiate between a conversion rate and a retention metric. My parents retained 30% between them, and I would be offered a 10% stake as a performance incentive, contingent on supporting Jessica's leadership transition and maintaining operational excellence during the restructuring period. Performance incentive. The phrase felt like a slap wrapped in corporate speak. I learned about the ownership transfer not from another family meeting, but from Marcus Chen, our lead account manager, who had accidentally been copied on an email thread between my parents and their accountant. Marcus knocked on my office door Thursday morning, coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand, and closed the door behind him with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. "Sarah," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I think there's something you need to know about the restructuring." He slid his phone across the desk, screen displaying an email chain that began with subject line, "Mitchell Associates Ownership Transfer, Tax Implications." I scrolled through the attorney correspondence, watching my life's work reduced to asset valuations and equity distributions. The business I had built was worth $8 million, according to the valuation report attached to the final message. Jessica would own $68 million of that value by virtue of being born 3 years after me and possessing what my father called natural leadership charisma. The email chain revealed other details that my parents hadn't mentioned during our family meeting. Jessica would have full authority over personnel decisions, client relationship management, and strategic direction. She would be moving into the larger corner office currently occupied by our parents. My role would be formally redesignated as Operations Manager, reporting directly to Jessica, with responsibility for campaign execution, vendor management, and administrative oversight. I would maintain my current salary, but my annual bonus structure would be eliminated and replaced with the performance-based equity offering. Marcus watched me read, his expression shifting between anger and sympathy. When I finished scrolling, I handed his phone back and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles I had selected during our office renovation 2 years ago. "How long have you known?" I asked. Marcus shrugged. "The email came through about an hour ago. I figured they'd tell you themselves, but..." He trailed off, and we both understood what he wasn't saying. They hadn't planned to tell me the full scope. They had intended to present this as a gradual transition, allowing me to discover the extent of the transfer piece by piece, keeping me off balance and compliant. "Marcus," I said, still looking at the ceiling, "do you remember when we updated the employee handbook 3 years ago? When I was obsessing over intellectual property clauses and making everyone read through policy revisions?" Marcus nodded slowly. "You kept talking about protecting the company's proprietary systems. You made us all sign those acknowledgement forms." I smiled, feeling the first spark of clarity I'd experienced since Wednesday's meeting. I wasn't protecting the company's systems. I was protecting mine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weekend gave me time to conduct my research properly. I spread the relevant documents across my dining room table Saturday morning, creating what Elena Rodriguez would later describe as a legal war room. Employee Handbook Section 4. 7. Subsection C, which I had drafted personally. My individual copyright registrations for the client management software I had developed. The system architecture documentation that bore my digital signature and creative attribution. The non-disclosure agreements that specifically differentiated between company proprietary information and individual intellectual property contributions. Most importantly, I reviewed the partnership agreements that my parents had signed when they initially incorporated Mitchell and Associates 15 years ago. They had been so focused on protecting themselves from each other and potential future partners that they had never considered how their policies might interact with intellectual property created by family members who were also employees. The core oversight was about to become expensive. Elena arrived Sunday afternoon with a briefcase full of legal precedents and a bottle of wine she insisted we would need for what she called contract archaeology. We spent 4 hours dissecting every relevant document, cross-referencing clause dependencies, and identifying potential leverage points. Elena's legal training combined with her intimate knowledge of my paranoid personality created a comprehensive understanding of exactly what I had built into the company's legal foundation. "Sarah," Elena said around 9 p.m., looking up from a stack of copyright documentation. "I think you might be the most accidentally brilliant person I've ever met. Did you realize what you were creating when you wrote these protections?" I shook my head. I was just scared that if the company ever got sold, or if something happened to my parents, I'd lose credit for the systems I was building. I wanted to make sure my contributions were documented and protected. Elena laughed, the kind of delighted sound that lawyers make when they discover their opponent has made a critical error. "You didn't just protect your contributions. You created a mechanism that makes it legally impossible for anyone to operate this business without your explicit consent. Every major system, every proprietary tool, every automated process that makes Mitchell & Associates profitable is individually owned by you under intellectual property law. They can transfer the business, but they can't transfer your systems." The implications crystallized as Elena explained the legal framework I had inadvertently constructed. The client management system that tracked contact preferences, campaign, history, and retention strategies was my intellectual property, licensed to Mitchell & Associates under terms that required my ongoing consent. The automated reporting tools that generated the analytics our clients relied on were registered under my individual developer credentials, with usage rights that could be revoked with 30 days' notice. The campaign workflow processes that had increased our operational efficiency were documented as my original methodologies, protected under the same intellectual property clauses that I had insisted on including in our employee policies. Jessica could inherit 60% ownership of Mitchell & Associates, but she would be inheriting a business that couldn't function without my cooperation. Every time a client logged into our management portal, they would be using software that I owned. Every automated report that demonstrated campaign performance would be generated by tools that required my permission to operate. Every efficient process that allowed us to handle 25 clients with a staff of 12 people was dependent on systems that legally belonged to me. But the most beautiful part of my accidental legal fortress was the termination clause buried in subsection D. If my employment with Mitchell & Associates ended for any reason other than documented performance issues or criminal activity, I retained the right to revoke all licensing agreements for my intellectual property after a 60-day transition period. The clause had been designed to protect me if the company was sold to strangers. I had never considered how it might apply if the company was given to my sister. Elena and I spent Monday morning confirming the enforcement mechanisms. The software licensing agreements were backed by federal intellectual property law. The methodology documentation had been properly registered and attributed. The system architecture blueprints were copyrighted under my individual name with clear creation timestamps. Everything was defensible, everything was documented, and everything would hold up in court if necessary. More importantly, everything was already implemented and integrated into daily operations. The business couldn't function without my systems, and my systems couldn't be legally used without my permission. Jessica was inheriting a company that would cease to operate the moment I decided to exercise my intellectual property rights. I had spent 3 years building legal protections into the foundation of Mitchell & Associates, thinking I was being cautiously paranoid about theoretical future scenarios. Instead, I had been preparing for exactly this betrayal, creating leverage that my parents couldn't eliminate and Jessica couldn't overcome. The operational expertise they were so willing to dismiss had included the foresight to protect everything that actually made the operation possible. Monday afternoon, I returned to the office with a comprehensive understanding of my position and a carefully planned strategy for the weeks ahead. Jessica was already rearranging the corner office, moving in furniture from what appeared to be an expensive shopping expedition. My parents were touring her around the building, introducing her to staff members and clients as the new creative visionary who would be leading the company's next phase of growth. I smiled and participated in the transition meetings, reviewed her proposed organizational changes, and offered helpful suggestions about client preferences and operational considerations. I was professional, supportive, and thoroughly cooperative. I answered her questions about campaign management protocols, explained the technical specifications of our reporting systems, and provided detailed documentation about vendor relationships and client communication preferences. What I didn't mention was that every system I was explaining was legally mine. Every process I was documenting was protected by intellectual property law. Every tool that made her new position possible was licensed software that could be revoked whenever I chose to exercise my rights. I was playing the role of the supportive sister, the reliable operations manager who would help facilitate a smooth leadership transition. But I was also conducting reconnaissance, documenting exactly how dependent the business had become on the infrastructure I had built. Every question Jessica asked revealed another area where she would be helpless without my cooperation. Every process she wanted to modify required systems that she couldn't legally access without my permission. The irony was exquisite. My parents were proudly showing off the business they were transferring to their visionary daughter, completely unaware that they were handing her the keys to a house built on land that someone else owned. Jessica was enthusiastically planning her creative revolution, oblivious to the fact that every revolutionary idea would require the cooperation of the sister she was displacing. By the end of that first week, I had confirmed what Elena and I had discovered during our legal excavation. Mitchell and Associates was my intellectual property, licensed to a company that my parents happened to own. They could transfer ownership of the business entity, but they couldn't transfer ownership of everything that made the business viable. They had built their retirement plan on a foundation they didn't own, and they were about to discover that operational expertise sometimes includes understanding exactly which laws protect the person doing the operations. I hadn't activated the clause yet. I was still gathering information, documenting dependencies, and preparing for the conversation that would change everything. But for the first time since Wednesday's meeting, I felt like I was operating from a position of strength, rather than reacting to decisions made about my future without my input. Jessica could have the corner office and the creative director title. She could own 60% of Mitchell and Associates on paper. But when she tried to access the systems that actually ran the business, she was going to discover that some things couldn't be inherited, transferred, or taken without permission. And permission was something she was going to have to ask me for, very nicely, every single day for the rest of her career. The only question was whether I would feel like granting it. Jessica's first month as creative director unfolded like watching someone try to conduct an orchestra without understanding music. She arrived each morning with ambitious plans and expensive coffee, settling into the corner office that had been hastily redecorated with trendy furniture and motivational wall art, featuring phrases like, "disrupt everything," and "think outside." The box. She scheduled back-to-back client meetings, eager to share her vision for what she called next-generation marketing solutions. What she didn't understand was that vision meant nothing without the systems to execute it. I watched from my newly assigned workspace as Jessica attempted to implement her first major initiative, a comprehensive social media overhaul for our largest client, Pacific Northwest Outdoor Gear. She had spent 2 weeks developing what she described as a revolutionary content strategy that would leverage authentic storytelling to drive engagement across multiple platforms. The presentation was polished, complete with mood boards and demographic analysis that looked impressive, until you realized it was based on outdated market research and generic industry reports, rather than our clients' actual customer data. The problems began immediately. Jessica couldn't access the client management system that contained 5 years of detailed customer interaction history because the software required administrator credentials that were tied to my individual user profile. She couldn't generate the performance metrics that Pacific Northwest Outdoor Gear used to evaluate campaign effectiveness because the reporting tools operated through proprietary code that I had developed and maintained. Most critically, She couldn't implement any of her creative concepts because the workflow management system that coordinated between our design team, copywriters, and media buyers was built around processes that existed solely in my documentation. Marcus Chen approached me Wednesday morning during my coffee break, his expression carefully neutral in the way that indicated he was about to share information he wasn't supposed to have. "Jessica called an emergency team meeting for this afternoon," he said, settling into the chair across from my small table in our break room. "Apparently, the Pacific Northwest campaign isn't going as smoothly as she expected." I stirred sugar into my coffee and waited for him to continue. Marcus had become my unofficial intelligence source over the past month, feeding me information about Jessica's struggles without directly criticizing our new leadership structure. "She's been trying to access the campaign analytics for 3 days," Marcus continued. "The client wants to see performance data from their previous campaigns to compare against her new strategy recommendations. Jessica keeps asking different team members to pull the reports, but nobody knows how to operate your custom dashboard system." I nodded thoughtfully. The analytics dashboard was one of my more sophisticated creations, designed to automatically compile data from multiple advertising platforms, social media channels, and website tracking systems. It required specific database queries and custom programming to generate meaningful reports, skills that nobody else in the company had bothered to develop since I had always handled that responsibility. "What's she telling the client?" I asked. Marcus grimaced. "That we're upgrading our reporting systems and the data will be available soon. Pacific Northwest is getting impatient. They're scheduled for a progress review meeting on Friday, and Jessica doesn't have any actual performance metrics to show them." The irony was delicious. Jessica's revolutionary content strategy couldn't be evaluated without the operational systems she had dismissed as mundane administrative work. She was discovering that creative vision required data-driven implementation, and all the data belonged to me. The emergency team meeting that afternoon provided my first opportunity to observe Jessica's leadership style under pressure. She stood at the front of our main conference room, her usually perfect composure showing subtle cracks as she addressed the assembled staff. "I want to talk about some challenges we're facing with our current systems integration," she began, her voice carrying the forced optimism of someone trying to maintain authority while clearly struggling. "It's become apparent that our technical infrastructure needs some updating to support the creative initiatives we're implementing." She gestured toward a whiteboard covered in her handwriting, outlining what she called immediate action items for operational optimization. The list included phrases like streamline reporting protocols, simplify campaign tracking, and democratize data access. What she was actually describing, without seeming to realize it, was her inability to access or operate any of the systems that made the agency functional. She wanted to simplify processes that couldn't be simplified without losing functionality, and democratize access to tools that required specialized knowledge to use effectively. "Sarah?" Jessica said, turning toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'd like you to work with our IT consultant to document current system specifications and identify opportunities for improvement. We need to ensure that all team members can access the tools they need to support our clients effectively." The request sounded reasonable until you understood what she was actually asking. She wanted me to reverse engineer my own proprietary systems and create user manuals that would allow other people to operate tools that I owned and controlled. I nodded professionally. "I'd be happy to document our current systems," I replied. "However, I should mention that many of our most effective tools are built on proprietary software with specific licensing requirements. Any modifications or access expansions would need to be reviewed for compliance with intellectual property agreements." The room fell silent as team members tried to process what I had just said. Jessica's smile became more strained. "What kind of licensing requirements?" she asked. "Standard intellectual property protections," I explained casually. "The custom software, reporting algorithms, and workflow processes were developed using my individual credentials and are protected under federal copyright law. The company has usage licenses, but any changes to access levels or functionality would require updating those licensing agreements. I could see Jessica trying to calculate the implications while maintaining her confident leadership facade. She had no idea what intellectual property licensing meant in practical terms, but she was beginning to understand that it might be complicated. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. "Does that affect our ability to generate client reports?" he asked. I shrugged. "Not as long as the current licensing terms remain in effect. The systems are designed to operate smoothly under normal circumstances. It's only when we want to modify access or transfer control that licensing becomes a consideration." Jessica's face had gone pale as she grasped the basic concept that the tools she needed to do her job were not actually hers to control. The meeting ended with Jessica assigning various team members to research alternative software solutions and scheduling individual consultations with staff members to identify workflow optimization opportunities. What she was really doing was trying to figure out how to replace systems that couldn't be replaced because they were specifically designed for our clients' needs and integrated with platforms that required my authentication credentials to access. Over the following week, I watched Jessica's confidence erode as she encountered the reality of trying to manage a business built on infrastructure she didn't understand or control. She couldn't modify the client intake process because it was automated through software that required my administrative access. She couldn't adjust campaign budgets or timeline because the project management system operated through algorithms that I had programmed based on years of experience with client preferences and vendor capabilities. She couldn't even update our standard contract templates because they were integrated with legal compliance checks that referenced intellectual property protections she was just beginning to comprehend. The Pacific Northwest Outdoor Gear meeting on Friday morning became a disaster that crystallized Jessica's impossible position. She had prepared an impressive presentation about engagement metrics and brand positioning, complete with colorful charts and social media mock-ups. But when the client asked for specific performance data from their current campaigns, Jessica had to admit that our reporting systems were temporarily unavailable due to upgrades. When they requested projections, based on historical conversion rates, she couldn't provide numbers because the analytics tools remained inaccessible. David Morrison, Pacific Northwest's marketing director, sat back in his chair and studied Jessica with the expression of someone who had just realized he might be dealing with an amateur. "Jessica," he said carefully, "we've been working with Mitchell and Associates for 4 years specifically because of your sophisticated data analysis and campaign optimization capabilities. Are you telling me that those capabilities are no longer available?" Jessica's attempt to explain the situation only made things worse, as her description of system upgrades and workflow optimization sounded increasingly like corporate speak designed to disguise incompetence. "Perhaps we should include Sarah in this conversation," David suggested, glancing toward me. "She's always been our primary point of contact for technical questions and performance analysis." Jessica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded graciously. "Of course. Sarah has been instrumental in our operational systems development." I joined the conversation and within 10 minutes had accessed the analytics dashboard, generated the requested performance reports, and provided detailed projections based on campaign history and seasonal trends. David Morrison visibly relaxed as I walked him through the data he needed, explaining conversion patterns and optimization opportunities with the kind of detailed knowledge that comes from years of hands-on campaign management. When the meeting ended, he shook my hand and said, "Sarah, I hope you'll continue to be our primary technical contact regardless of any organizational changes. Your expertise is really what makes our partnership valuable." I assured him that I would remain available to support his campaigns as long as the current systems remained operational. Jessica walked David to the elevator, maintaining her professional demeanor until the doors closed. Then she returned to the conference room, where I was packing up my laptop and asked the question that I had been expecting for weeks. "Sarah, I need to understand exactly what you mean by intellectual property licensing. Are you saying that you personally own the software we use to manage our clients? I looked up from my laptop bag and met her eyes directly. Not the software. Platform, I clarified. I own the custom applications, algorithms, and processes that make the platform useful for our specific business needs. The client management system, the reporting tools, the campaign optimization processes, all of that is my intellectual property, licensed to Mitchell and Associates under terms that were established when I created those systems. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, processing the implications. What would happen if you decided to revoke those licenses? She asked quietly. I had been preparing for this question for weeks, and my answer was carefully measured. The company would need to replace those systems with alternative solutions, which would require rebuilding our entire operational infrastructure from scratch. It would take months to develop comparable functionality, assuming someone had the technical expertise to recreate what I've built over the past 6 years. Jessica's face had gone completely pale now. How long would clients wait for those alternative solutions? She asked. That would depend on the client, I replied. Some might be willing to accept reduced functionality during a transition period. Others would probably look for agencies that could provide the level of service they're accustomed to receiving. I paused, then added, David Morrison, for example, has been very clear that our technical capabilities are the primary reason Pacific Northwest continues working with us. If those capabilities became unavailable, I imagine he would evaluate other options pretty quickly. The conversation ended there, but I could see Jessica's mind working as she tried to calculate how to navigate a situation where her authority as creative director was undermined by her dependence on systems she couldn't control. She was beginning to understand that owning 60% of Mitchell and Associates meant very little if the actual operational capacity belonged to someone else. The business they had transferred to her was built on my intellectual property, and intellectual property couldn't be inherited or reassigned without the owner's consent. That evening, I received a text message from my mother asking if I would be available for dinner on Sunday to discuss some family business matters. The invitation was phrased politely, but I recognized the underlying urgency. Jessica had undoubtedly briefed my parents on her growing realization that the company transfer wasn't going as smoothly as they had anticipated. They were starting to understand that their operational daughter had been more strategically minded than they had given her credit for. I agreed to Sunday dinner, knowing that the conversation would represent the beginning of the real negotiation. Jessica had spent 4 weeks discovering that creative vision meant nothing without operational control, and operational control was something that couldn't be transferred or inherited. It belonged to the person who had built the systems, documented the processes, and retained the legal rights to everything that made the business functional. My parents were about to learn that giving away my company had been considerably more complicated than they had realized. The clause they had never read was about to become the most important paragraph in Mitchell and Associates' corporate history, and I was finally ready to explain exactly what it meant for their retirement plans and Jessica's creative ambitions. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always been a ritual of forced family bonding, but that evening carried the weight of a corporate boardroom negotiation disguised as pot roast and small talk. I arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bottle of wine that I knew would remain unopened given the serious nature of the conversation we were about to have. The dining room table was set with my mother's good china, the kind she reserved for important occasions and uncomfortable discussions that required the illusion of civility. Jessica was already seated when I entered, her usual confidence replaced by the tense posture of someone who had spent the weekend researching intellectual property law and discovering just how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. My father occupied his traditional spot at the head of the table, but his typical authoritative demeanor seemed diminished by the growing realization that his business succession plan had encountered a complication he hadn't anticipated. My mother bustled between the kitchen and dining room, her nervous energy manifesting in unnecessary adjustments to place settings and repeated offers of beverages that nobody wanted. We made it through the salad course and most of the main dish before my father finally addressed the reason for our gathering. "Sarah," he began, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "Jessica has raised some concerns about operational continuity during the leadership transition. She mentioned something about licensing agreements and system access issues that might be affecting our ability to serve clients effectively." His tone carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to gather information without revealing the extent of his own ignorance about the situation. I finished chewing my bite of pot roast and met his gaze directly. "The systems are functioning normally under current licensing terms," I replied. "However, any changes to access levels, user permissions, or administrative control would require updating the intellectual property agreements that govern those systems." My mother paused in her nervous fidgeting, sensing that this conversation was moving into territory that would fundamentally alter our family dynamic. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, clearly having briefed my parents on the scope of the problem without fully understanding it herself. "What exactly do you mean by intellectual property agreements?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the kind of forced lightness that indicated she was hoping the answer would be less serious than she suspected. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and my response was measured and precise. "The client management software, analytics dashboard, campaign automation tools, and workflow processes that make Mitchell and Associates profitable are my individual intellectual property, protected under federal copyright law and licensed to the company under specific terms." The silence that followed my explanation stretched across the dining room like a fault line, dividing our family into those who understood the implications and those who were still processing what I had just revealed. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying that you own the systems that run the business?" I nodded. "The systems that are essential for daily operations, client service, and revenue generation? Yes. I developed them over 6 years using my individual credentials and registered them under my personal copyright." My father's face had taken on the color of someone who had just realized that his retirement portfolio contained a critical error. "Sarah," he said slowly, "when we transferred majority ownership to Jessica, we assumed that included operational control of all business assets and systems." I shook my head. "Ownership of the business entity doesn't transfer ownership of intellectual property created by individual employees. The licensing agreements allow the company to use my systems, but they don't transfer ownership of those systems to whoever owns the company." Jessica leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What would it take to transfer ownership of those systems to the company?" she asked. The question I had been expecting, and the one that would determine whether this conversation ended in negotiation or complete family warfare. "Intellectual property transfer would require fair market compensation based on the value of the systems to business operations," I replied. "Given that these systems generate approximately 70% of our operational efficiency and client retention, the transfer value would be substantial." "How substantial?" my father asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected. The answer would be more than they could afford. I had spent considerable time with Elena Rodriguez calculating exactly this figure, and our analysis had been thorough. The custom software alone would be valued at approximately $1.2 million based on development costs, implementation time, and revenue generation capacity. The proprietary processes and methodologies would add another $800,000 to the valuation. A complete intellectual property transfer would cost approximately $2 million. The number hit the table like a physical object, heavy and unmovable. My parents exchanged glances that communicated years of shared financial planning suddenly rendered obsolete. Jessica stared at her plate as if the china pattern might reveal a solution to her impossible situation. $2 million was more than the company's liquid assets, more than my parents could access without liquidating their retirement investments, and more than Jessica could afford, even if she mortgaged her entire future. "There has to be another option," my mother said, desperately. "Some kind of family arrangement that would allow everyone to work together without these legal complications." I had anticipated this appeal to family loyalty, and my response was gentle but firm. "The legal complications exist because intellectual property law doesn't recognize family relationships as grounds for transferring ownership without compensation. The systems I created are my professional work product, and they're protected regardless of our personal relationships." Jessica finally looked up from her plate, her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration. "So what you're saying is that I can own 60% of Mitchell & Associates, but I can't actually operate the business without your permission?" The accuracy of her assessment was both tragic and satisfying. "You can operate the business under the current licensing terms," I clarified, "but you can't modify the systems, transfer control to other users, or continue operations if the licensing agreements are terminated." "And what would cause the licensing agreements to be terminated?" my father asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would not be reassuring. I had memorized the relevant clause weeks ago, and I recited it with the precision of someone who had written every word. "The licensing agreements terminate automatically if my employment with Mitchell & Associates ends for any reason other than documented performance issues or criminal activity. They also terminate if I choose to revoke them with 60 days written notice." The implications of that clause settled over the dinner table like a fog, obscuring any clear path forward. Jessica owned majority control of a business that would cease to function if I decided to leave or revoke my cooperation. My parents had transferred their life's work to someone who could only maintain it with the ongoing consent of the daughter they had just demoted. The succession plan they had conceived as a simple family business transfer had become a hostage situation where I held all the leverage. "Sarah," my father said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that I had never heard before. "What would it take for you to maintain the current licensing agreements and continue working with Jessica to grow the business?" The question represented a fundamental shift in our family power dynamic, and everyone at the table understood its significance. For the first time in my adult life, my parents were asking for my terms instead of dictating theirs. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting with Elena Rodriguez about legal strategies and Marcus Chen about operational realities. My response would determine not just the future of Mitchell & Associates, but the nature of my relationships with my family for decades to come. "I want 40% ownership of the company, equal to Jessica's stake after adjustment," I said. "I want the title of Chief Operating Officer with veto power over any decisions that affect the systems I've developed. I want a guaranteed annual salary of $150,000 plus 20% of annual profits. And I want all of this formalized in legal documents that can't be modified without my explicit consent." The demands were significant but not unreasonable given the value I brought to the business and the legal position I occupied. Jessica would retain her majority ownership and creative control, but she would have to acknowledge that the business required my ongoing participation to remain viable. My parents would keep their 20% stake in their retirement plans, but they would have to accept that their operational daughter had become an equal partner rather than a supporting employee. "Those terms seem," my father began, then stopped, clearly recognizing that he was in no position to negotiate. Jessica looked at him desperately, hoping he might have some alternative that would restore her independent authority. My mother continued her nervous fidgeting, rearranging silverware that didn't need rearranging while the future of our family business hung in the balance. "I need time to consider this," Jessica said finally, her voice hollow with the realization that her inheritance had come with conditions she couldn't escape. "How much time?" I asked, maintaining the professional tone that had characterized this entire conversation. "The Pacific Northwest outdoor gear contract comes up for renewal in 3 weeks. David Morrison has been asking about long-term technical support capabilities. I need to know whether to assure him that our systems will remain stable. The deadline was real and meaningful. Pacific Northwest represented 30% of our annual revenue, and their contract renewal was contingent on maintaining the service levels they had grown accustomed to receiving. If Jessica couldn't provide assurance about operational continuity, we would lose our largest client within a month. The timing pressure would force a decision before anyone could develop alternative plans or seek legal advice that might complicate the negotiation. 2 weeks, my father said, looking at Jessica for confirmation. She nodded reluctantly, understanding that delaying would only make her position worse as other clients began questioning the agency's stability. 2 weeks to formalize the partnership agreement and update ownership documents. I agreed to the timeline, knowing that it provided sufficient opportunity for everyone to accept the new reality while preventing any attempts to circumvent my legal protections. The dinner ended with polite conversation about neutral topics, but the undercurrent of fundamental change permeated every interaction. Jessica helped clear the table with the mechanical movements of someone processing a major life adjustment. My parents discussed holiday plans with forced normalcy while calculating how their retirement timeline had just been altered. I participated in the social rituals while internally preparing for the most significant negotiation of my professional career. Over the following week, Jessica attempted to explore alternatives that might restore her independent control of the business. She consulted with technology vendors about replacing my custom systems, only to discover that comparable functionality would require months of development and hundreds of thousands of dollars in upfront costs. She researched legal precedents for challenging intellectual property claims, but Elena Rodriguez had constructed my protections too carefully for successful contestation. Most significantly, Jessica tried to operate the business without relying on my systems, hoping to demonstrate that she could maintain client service through alternative methods. The experiment lasted 3 days before Marcus Chen reported that campaign performance was declining, client complaints were increasing, and staff members were struggling to complete basic tasks without access to the automated tools they had grown dependent on. The reality of modern business operations was that efficiency gains couldn't be reversed without losing competitive advantage. Our clients expected the level of service that my systems enabled, and our profit margins depended on the operational efficiency that my processes provided. Jessica could own the business legally, but she couldn't operate it practically without my intellectual property and ongoing cooperation. The formal negotiation took place in Elena Rodriguez's law office on a Thursday morning, with both parties represented by attorneys and all terms carefully documented in binding agreements. Jessica arrived with her own legal counsel, a corporate lawyer who had reviewed my intellectual property protections and advised her that challenging them would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. My parents attended as witnesses, their expressions reflecting acceptance of circumstances they couldn't control. The final partnership agreement reflected the terms I had outlined at Sunday dinner with minor modifications that protected both parties' interests. I received 40% ownership and the Chief Operating Officer title, with guaranteed compensation and veto power over technical decisions. Jessica retained her majority stake and creative authority, but acknowledged legal limitations on her ability to modify or replace core business systems. My parents kept their 20% and their retirement plans, but accepted reduced control over succession decisions. Most importantly, the agreement included provisions for business continuity that protected all parties from future disputes. My intellectual property rights were formally recognized and compensated through increased ownership rather than cash payment. Jessica's creative authority was clearly defined to prevent conflicts over strategic direction. The operational structure was documented to ensure that future family disagreements couldn't disrupt client service or business performance. 6 months later, Mitchell & Associates was more profitable than it had ever been under my parents' management. Jessica's creative vision, supported by my operational systems, had generated innovative campaigns that impressed clients and attracted new business. The partnership structure had eliminated the inefficiencies that arose when creative decisions were made without operational input, and when operational capabilities were developed without creative direction. Our client base had expanded by 20%, with several major accounts specifically citing our combination of creative innovation and technical sophistication as the reason for choosing our agency over larger competitors. Pacific Northwest Outdoor Gear had not only renewed their contract, but increased their budget after seeing the results of campaigns that integrated Jessica's creative concepts with my data-driven optimization processes. The family dynamics had stabilized into a professional partnership that acknowledged everyone's contributions without the resentment that had characterized our previous relationships. Jessica had learned to appreciate the complexity of business operations and the value of technical expertise. My parents had accepted that their daughters were both capable of leadership in different ways that complemented rather than competed with each other. Most satisfying, I had achieved recognition for the work I had been doing invisibly for 6 years, with a title and compensation that reflected my actual contribution to the business. The intellectual property protections that I had built into the company's legal foundation had proven their worth, not just as defensive measures but as tools for establishing fair partnerships based on mutual dependence and respect. The clause they had never read had become the foundation of a business structure that was stronger, more profitable, and more sustainable than anything my parents had originally envisioned. Sometimes the most important legal protections are the ones that force families to treat each other as equal partners instead of taking advantage of loyalty and dedication. Jessica learned that creative vision without operational capability is just expensive dreaming. My parents learned that succession planning requires understanding what you're actually transferring. And I learned that sometimes the best way to protect your life's work is to make sure that everyone who benefits from it understands exactly how much they need you to keep it running. The business I had built was finally mine, and the family who had tried to give it away discovered that some gifts come with conditions that can't be ignored, especially when those conditions are written into federal intellectual property law by someone who had been planning for this conversation longer than anyone realized. The transformation of Mitchell and Associates over the following 18 months exceeded every projection I had made during those tense weeks of legal maneuvering and family negotiations. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect my life's work evolved into the most successful period in the company's 15-year history, proving that sometimes the best business partnerships are forged in the crucible of necessity rather than the comfort of assumption. Jessica's initial resentment about our enforced collaboration gradually dissolved as she discovered the creative possibilities that emerged when visionary concepts were supported by sophisticated operational infrastructure. Her first major success came through a campaign for Cascade Brewing, a local craft beer company that wanted to expand into the California market. Jessica's creative strategy involved storytelling that positioned Cascade as authentic Pacific Northwest craftsmanship. But the campaign's effectiveness depended entirely on data analytics that tracked consumer behavior patterns across different regional markets. My customer segmentation algorithms identified specific demographic clusters in Los Angeles and San Francisco that responded positively to authenticity messaging, while my automated A/B testing protocols optimized ad placement timing and visual elements to maximize engagement rates. Jessica's creative vision provided the emotional hook that captured attention, but my technical systems provided the precision targeting that converted attention into sales. The campaign generated a 47% increase in California distribution for Cascade Brewing within 6 months, results that neither of us could have achieved independently. The success of the Cascade campaign established a collaboration model that we refined through subsequent projects. Jessica would develop creative concepts based on market research and brand positioning, then work with me to implement those concepts through technical systems that could measure effectiveness and optimize performance in real time. My role evolved from invisible operational support to strategic technical partnership, with my expertise in data analysis and process automation becoming as valued as Jessica's skills in creative development and client relationship management. Marcus Chen, who had observed our transition from family conflict to professional partnership, later described it as watching two different languages gradually merge into a shared vocabulary. Jessica learned to evaluate creative concepts based on measurable performance metrics, while I began incorporating emotional resonance and brand consistency into my technical specifications. Our weekly strategy meetings transformed from polite disagreements about priorities into collaborative problem-solving sessions where creative challenges were addressed through technical innovation. The financial results spoke more eloquently than any theoretical discussion about partnership dynamics. By the end of our first full year as co-leaders, Mitchell and Associates had increased annual revenue by 38%, expanded our client base by 52%, and achieved a 93% client retention rate that was unprecedented in our industry. The combination of Jessica's creative vision and my operational excellence had created a competitive advantage that larger agencies struggled to replicate. Our success attracted attention from industry publications and potential acquisition targets. Portland Business Journal featured Mitchell and Associates in a cover story about innovative family businesses, highlighting our unique collaboration model as an example of how complementary skill sets could generate exponential growth when properly integrated. Jessica handled the interview with characteristic charm and media savvy, but she made sure to emphasize my technical contributions and operational leadership throughout the discussion. The recognition felt surreal after years of working behind the scenes while others received credit for achievements that depended on my invisible contributions. Seeing my name in print as Chief Operating Officer, reading quotes attributed to me about business strategy and technical innovation, participating in industry panels as an expert rather than supporting staff, represented validation that extended beyond financial compensation or organizational titles. More importantly, the public recognition of our partnership began attracting clients who specifically sought agencies that could combine creative excellence with technical sophistication. Titanium Sports, a national athletic equipment manufacturer, hired us specifically because their previous agency had failed to integrate creative campaigns with performance analytics. Their marketing director explained that they needed partners who could measure emotional engagement as precisely as they measured sales conversion, a capability that required exactly the kind of collaboration Jessica and I had developed. The Titanium Sports project pushed both of us beyond our individual comfort zones in ways that strengthened our professional relationship and mutual respect. Jessica's creative strategy involved partnering with local athletes to create authentic content about training dedication and competitive achievement, but measuring the emotional impact of that content required sentiment analysis algorithms and social media monitoring tools that went beyond standard analytics packages. I developed custom software that could track not just engagement metrics like likes and shares, but emotional indicators like comment sentiment, brand association strength, and purchase intent correlation across different athlete partnerships. The system allowed us to identify which athlete collaborations generated the strongest emotional connections with target demographics, then optimize content distribution and advertising spend to amplify the most effective partnerships. Jessica's creative instincts proved remarkably accurate when supported by comprehensive data analysis. Her hypothesis that authentic athlete stories would outperform traditional advertising was validated by conversion rates that exceeded industry standards by 200%. My technical systems provided the measurement framework that proved her creative theories worked, while her creative vision gave meaning and direction to the data patterns my algorithms identified. The success of major projects like Titanium, Sports and Cascade Brewing created a waiting list of potential clients who wanted to work specifically with our integrated approach. We were able to increase our rates significantly while maintaining full capacity, a pricing power that reflected the unique value proposition we had created through our enforced collaboration. My parents, who had initially viewed our partnership arrangement as a necessary compromise to salvage their succession planning mistake, gradually recognized that our collaboration had transformed Mitchell and Associates into something more valuable than either of them had originally envisioned. The business they had built as a traditional marketing consultancy had evolved into a specialized agency that commanded premium rates for technical innovation combined with creative excellence. The financial benefits extended beyond increased revenue to include operational efficiencies that improved profitability across all client relationships. My automated systems reduced the time required for campaign management and performance reporting, allowing our staff to handle larger client loads without proportional increases in labor costs. Jessica's streamlined creative processes eliminated the revision cycles and miscommunication that had previously caused project delays and budget overruns. Our combined efficiency improvements increased profit margins by 23%, while simultaneously improving client satisfaction scores. Across every measurable category, we were delivering better results more efficiently than ever before, generating higher profits for the company while providing superior value for our clients. The partnership structure that had initially felt like a legal necessity gradually became the foundation for strategic planning that neither of us could have developed independently. Jessica's understanding of market trends and creative opportunities informed my technical development priorities, while my insights about data patterns and operational constraints guided her creative strategy decisions. When Jessica proposed expanding into video production services, my analysis of client request patterns and competitive positioning supported her intuition that motion graphics and animated content represented significant growth opportunities. When I identified inefficiencies in our project management workflows, Jessica's experience with client communication preferences helped design solutions that improved both operational efficiency and client experience. Our quarterly business reviews evolved into sophisticated strategic planning sessions where creative vision and operational analysis were integrated from the initial conceptualization stage. We would identify market opportunities through Jessica's industry relationships and trend analysis, then evaluate implementation feasibility through my technical capabilities and resource allocation models. The planning process itself became a competitive advantage as we could evaluate potential projects more comprehensively than agencies that separated creative and operational decision-making. Clients began involving us in strategic planning discussions rather than just campaign execution, expanding our role from service provider to strategic consultant and increasing both project scope and billing rates. Elena Rodriguez, who had helped construct the legal framework that forced our collaboration, observed during a social dinner that she had never seen a business partnership transition from legal necessity to genuine strategic alliance as smoothly as ours had developed. She credited our success to the fact that both parties had been forced to acknowledge our mutual dependence before ego or territorial instincts could interfere with practical cooperation. The legal protections that had initially served as weapons in our family conflict had evolved into the foundation for a business structure that protected both parties' interests while encouraging collaborative innovation. My intellectual property rights ensured that I received appropriate recognition and compensation for technical contributions, while Jessica's creative authority allowed her to pursue visionary projects without operational constraints. Perhaps, most significantly, our success had transformed our family relationships in ways that extended beyond business interactions. My parents, who had initially seen our partnership arrangement as an unfortunate complication of their succession planning, began referring to Mitchell and Associates as a model for how family businesses could leverage complementary talents instead of assuming traditional hierarchical structures. Jessica and I developed a genuine friendship based on mutual professional respect rather than family obligation. We discovered that our different approaches to problem solving were complementary, rather than competitive when we shared common goals and clear role definitions. Her creative intuition helped me understand market dynamics that couldn't be captured through data analysis alone, while my technical expertise gave her confidence to pursue ambitious creative concepts that might have seemed impractical without systematic implementation support. The Christmas party, 18 months after our initial partnership agreement, felt like a celebration of transformation rather than just annual tradition. Our staff had grown from 25 employees to 38. Our office space had expanded to include a dedicated analytics center and creative studio. And our client roster included national brands that had never considered working with Portland agencies before our innovative approach attracted their attention. Marcus Chen, who had been promoted to senior account director, raised a toast to the partnership that proved legal necessity could become creative opportunity. The sentiment captured something essential about what we had accomplished together, transforming a family conflict into a business success story that benefited everyone involved. Looking back on that Wednesday afternoon when Jessica's promotion had felt like professional execution, I could recognize the irony that losing control of my life's work had ultimately led to achieving more recognition, compensation, and creative satisfaction than I had ever experienced as the invisible operational foundation of someone else's business. The clause they never read had protected more than my intellectual property rights. It had protected my right to be valued for my actual contributions rather than dismissed as supporting infrastructure for other people's achievements. Sometimes the most important legal protections are the ones that force recognition of value that might otherwise remain invisible. Jessica learned that creative vision without operational capability was just expensive fantasy, while I learned that operational excellence without creative direction was just efficient mediocrity. Together, we had created something neither of us could have achieved independently, proving that the best partnerships are built on mutual necessity rather than mutual convenience. The business I had protected through legal maneuvering had become the platform for professional fulfillment that exceeded anything I had imagined when I was working invisibly to support other people's success. My parents' attempt to give away my life's work had inadvertently created the circumstances that allowed me to claim ownership of my professional identity and creative contributions. 2 years later, when Portland Business Journal named Mitchell & Associates as Small Business of the Year, both Jessica and I were featured equally in the cover story. The article described our collaboration as an innovative model for family businesses that wanted to leverage complementary expertise without traditional hierarchical limitations. We were invited to speak at industry conferences about integrated, creative, and technical strategies, with both of our names prominently featured in marketing materials. The recognition felt like vindication, not just for the legal battle that had forced our partnership, but for every year I had spent building systems and solving problems without acknowledgement. The intellectual property protections that had seemed like paranoid preparation for theoretical scenarios had proven to be the foundation for professional success that honored my actual contributions to our shared achievements. Mitchell & Associates had become something neither my parents nor Jessica nor I had originally envisioned, but something that reflected the best capabilities of everyone involved. The clause they never read had forced us to create a business structure based on mutual respect and shared success rather than traditional assumptions about hierarchy and recognition. Sometimes the most important contracts are the ones that protect your right to be valued for what you actually contribute rather than what other people assume you should accept. The legal protections I had built into Mitchell & Associates had ensured that my expertise would be recognized, my contributions would be compensated, and my professional identity would be honored regardless of family dynamics or traditional expectations. The business I had fought to retain had become the platform for achievements that exceeded my individual capabilities, proving that forced partnerships could evolve into collaborative innovation when legal frameworks protected everyone's essential contributions. Jessica's creative vision and my operational excellence had created something more valuable than either of us could have built independently, but only because legal necessity had forced mutual recognition before ego could interfere with practical cooperation. The story of how my parents gave my sister the company I built had become the story of how legal protections forced us to create something better than any of us had originally imagined. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is building something so successful that everyone benefits from the structure that initially felt like punishment. 5 years after that devastating Wednesday afternoon meeting, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the newly constructed Mitchell Innovation Center, a 12,000 square foot facility that housed not just our expanded agency operations, but also the Mitchell Institute for Creative Technology, a consulting division that licensed our integrated methodology to agencies across the Pacific Northwest. The building itself represented everything that had changed since Jessica's initial promotion had triggered what our family now referred to as the Great Restructuring. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated awards and recognitions that covered an entire wall of our reception area. Agency of the Year from the American Marketing Association, Innovation Excellence from the Portland Business Alliance, Best Places to Work recognition from Oregon Business Magazine for 3 consecutive years. But the achievement that meant the most to me was the framed certificate designating Mitchell & Associates as a certified women-owned business enterprise, with both Jessica's and my signatures prominently displayed as co-owners and co-leaders. Elena Rodriguez arrived early for our 10 o'clock meeting. Her attorney credentials now expanded to include business partnership consulting and intellectual property protection services that she had developed specifically to help other family businesses avoid the conflicts that had nearly destroyed ours. She settled into one of the comfortable chairs in my office, which occupied the entire southeast corner of the building's top floor, with panoramic views of downtown Portland and the Cascade Mountains beyond. "Sarah," Elena began, opening her briefcase and extracting a thick folder of documents. "I've been thinking about your story as I work with other family businesses facing similar succession challenges. What you accomplished here has become a template for how intellectual property protections can force equitable partnerships instead of allowing exploitation of family relationships." She gestured toward the windows overlooking our bustling office space. "But I think there's something even more significant that you've demonstrated about the long-term value of protecting your professional contributions." I followed her gaze. Across the open workspace where our team of 43 employees worked in collaborative clusters designed to facilitate the kind of creative technical integration that had become our signature approach. Jessica was visible in the glass-walled creative studio, leading a brainstorming session with our newest clients, executives from Nike, who had hired us specifically to develop data-driven storytelling campaigns for their Emerging Athletes program. Her animated gestures and infectious enthusiasm were exactly the same as they had been during those early days when I thought her charisma was just superficial charm. But now I could see the strategic thinking behind her creative presentations, the careful consideration of implementation logistics that she had learned to incorporate into every conceptual discussion. Jessica had evolved from someone who generated beautiful ideas without considering practical constraints into a creative leader who understood that the most innovative concepts were the ones that could be executed with precision and measured with accuracy. "The remarkable thing," Elena continued, "is that your legal protections didn't just prevent exploitation. They created conditions that forced everyone to develop capabilities they might never have discovered otherwise." Jessica learned operational thinking. Your parents learned to value technical expertise, and you learned that creative collaboration could enhance analytical work rather than compromise it. She paused, shuffling through documents that chronicled the various partnership agreements we had refined over the years. "But I think the most significant outcome is what you've built for other women in similar situations." The Mitchell Institute for Creative Technology had emerged almost accidentally from our success in developing integrated creative technical methodologies. Other agencies began requesting consultations about how to implement similar collaboration models within their own organizations. What started as informal advice sessions evolved into structured training programs, then into comprehensive partnership consulting that helped family businesses establish equitable collaboration frameworks. Our most successful intervention had involved Riverside Construction, a Portland-based firm where the founder's daughter had spent 15 years managing operations while her brother handled client relations and business development. When the ICHU founder decided to retire, he had initially planned to transfer leadership to the son, assuming that customer-facing roles were more important than operational management. The daughter had contacted Elena after learning about our story through industry networking. Elena and I had worked together to help the daughter document her operational contributions and establish intellectual property protections for the project management systems she had developed. When the family attempted to marginalize her role, during succession planning, she was able to demonstrate that the business couldn't function without her expertise and operational innovations. The resulting partnership agreement created a co-leadership structure that recognized both siblings' essential contributions. Riverside Construction is now one of the most profitable firms in their sector, Elena noted, pulling out a recent industry report that featured their success story. The daughter, Maria Santos, told me that learning to value her own expertise was the most important professional development of her career. She said watching your transformation from invisible contributor to recognized partner gave her the courage to demand appropriate recognition for her own work. The ripple effects of our story had extended beyond individual consultations to influence industry discussions about gender equity and family business succession. I had been invited to speak at conferences about intellectual property protection strategies, but increasingly those presentations evolved into discussions about how women could protect their professional contributions in family businesses where traditional hierarchies might undervalue their expertise. Jessica had become equally passionate about these issues, though her focus was on helping creative professionals understand the business implications of their artistic work. She frequently spoke about the importance of creative vision being supported by strategic implementation, emphasizing that the most innovative ideas were worthless without operational excellence to execute them effectively. Our speaking engagements had developed into a joint presentation format where we demonstrated our collaborative methodology while discussing the legal and business structures that made our partnership possible. The sessions were consistently overbooked, with waiting lists that extended months in advance. Event organizers told us that audiences were particularly interested in seeing successful professional collaboration between women who had different skill sets but equivalent authority. I've been documenting the requests we receive for partnership. Consulting, Elena said, opening her laptop to display a spreadsheet that tracked inquiries by industry, family structure, and conflict type. 67% involve situations where women's operational or technical contributions are being undervalued relative to male family members' client-facing or strategic roles. Your methodology for protecting intellectual property has become a standard framework for ensuring equitable treatment. The consulting work had grown into a significant revenue stream that allowed us to hire additional staff and expand our core agency services. More importantly, it had connected us with a network of women entrepreneurs who were using similar strategies to protect their professional contributions and demand appropriate recognition within family businesses. Rachel Morrison, founder of Morrison Digital Marketing in Seattle, had implemented our intellectual property protection framework when her ex-husband attempted to claim ownership of client relationship management systems she had developed during their marriage. The legal protections she established allowed her to maintain control of her business assets during their divorce proceedings, preserving the company she had built from becoming collateral damage in their personal relationship dissolution. Rachel credits your example with giving her the strategic thinking to protect herself before conflict escalated, Elena noted. She said that learning about your story helped her understand that professional expertise was something that could be legally protected rather than just personally asserted. Rachel had since become one of our closest collaborators, referring clients who needed integrated creative technical services, while we recommended businesses that required specialized digital marketing expertise. The network of women entrepreneurs who had implemented similar protective strategies had evolved into an informal support system that shared resources, referrals, and strategic advice. We organized quarterly meetings that combined professional development with peer mentoring, creating opportunities for women to learn from each other's experiences while building collaborative business relationships. Jessica had initially been skeptical about the time investment required for consulting and networking activities, concerned that external commitments might distract from our core agency work. But she gradually recognized that our involvement in these professional communities was generating referrals and partnerships that enhanced our primary business while establishing Mitchell and Associates as a thought leader in creative technical integration. The consulting work has become a competitive advantage, Jessica admitted during one of our weekly strategy meetings. Clients hire us because they know we understand business partnership dynamics and intellectual property protection. They trust us to handle complex projects because they've seen how we manage complex relationships. Her initial resistance to what she had perceived as peripheral activities had transformed into appreciation for how professional leadership responsibilities could reinforce business development. The success of our expanded professional activities had attracted attention from academic researchers studying family business dynamics and gender equity in entrepreneurship. Dr. Catherine Walsh from Portland State University's Business School had requested permission to develop a case study based on our partnership evolution, with particular focus on how legal frameworks could address systemic biases in family business succession. Your story challenges conventional assumptions about family business leadership, Dr. Walsh had explained during our initial interview. Most succession planning assumes that ownership transfer is sufficient to ensure business continuity. Your experience demonstrates that operational expertise and intellectual property can be more valuable than formal ownership, especially in knowledge-based industries where human capital is the primary asset. The academic interest had led to speaking opportunities at business schools, where we discussed our collaboration methodology with MBA students who were studying family business management and entrepreneurship. The sessions were particularly popular with female students who were planning careers in family businesses or considering starting their own companies. Young women tell me that seeing your partnership gives them language to articulate their own professional value, Dr. Walsh noted during a follow-up conversation. They learn that technical expertise and operational excellence are forms of leadership that deserve recognition and compensation, equivalent to more visible roles like client relations or strategic planning. The educational outreach had become one of the most personally satisfying aspects of our expanded professional activities. Sharing our story with students and emerging entrepreneurs felt like creating pathways for other women to avoid the conflicts we had experienced while developing the protective strategies they might need to ensure equitable treatment. Marcus Chen, who had been promoted to executive vice president and was now responsible for managing our core agency operations, frequently observed that our external consulting and speaking activities had made us better at our primary business. Explaining your methodology to other people forces you to refine your processes, he noted. Every consultation session teaches you something new about collaboration dynamics that improves how we work together internally. The continuous refinement of our collaborative processes had generated intellectual property that extended beyond our original systems into comprehensive methodologies for creative technical integration. We had developed training protocols, assessment frameworks, and implementation guidelines that other agencies could license to establish similar collaboration models within their own organizations. The licensing revenue had become substantial, enough to justify establishing a separate division focused entirely on methodology development and training delivery. Jessica led the creative aspects of training program development, while I handled the technical implementation and licensing administration. The division employed 8 people and generated nearly as much profit as our core agency work while requiring significantly less hands-on client management. What amazes me, Elena said, reviewing financial reports that showed steady growth across all our business divisions, is that protecting your individual contributions ended up creating opportunities that benefited everyone involved. Your parents. Retirement is more secure because the business is more valuable. Jessica has achieved creative recognition that extends beyond Portland. And you've established yourself as an industry expert whose expertise is sought by organizations across the country. The financial outcomes had exceeded every projection we had made during those tense weeks of legal maneuvering and family negotiations. The business that had been valued at $28 million during the initial ownership transfer was now worth more than $12 million, according to our most recent professional appraisal. My 40% ownership stake represented wealth that would provide financial security for the rest of my life while continuing to generate income through ongoing business operations. But the financial benefits, significant as they were, felt less important than the professional recognition and creative satisfaction that had emerged from our enforced collaboration. The work we did together was more innovative and impactful than anything either of us had accomplished independently. Our joint presentations were more engaging than individual speaking opportunities. Our collaborative consulting was more effective than solo advisory services. I think, Elena concluded, closing her briefcase and preparing to leave for her next appointment, that what you've really demonstrated is that the best professional relationships are built on mutual necessity rather than mutual convenience. Your legal protections forced recognition of interdependence that might never have been acknowledged otherwise. She paused at the door of my office, looking back at the wall of awards and recognitions. But more than that, you've shown that protecting your individual contributions can create collaborative opportunities that exceed what anyone could achieve alone. After Elena left, I remained in my office reviewing the quarterly reports that documented our continued growth and expansion. The numbers were impressive, but they represented something more significant than financial success. They represented proof that professional expertise deserved protection and recognition, regardless of family relationships or traditional hierarchical assumptions. The clause they never read had protected more than intellectual property rights. It had protected my right to be valued for my actual contributions rather than dismissed as supporting infrastructure for other people's achievements. The legal framework that had initially felt like a defensive necessity had evolved into the foundation for collaborative innovation that benefited everyone involved. Jessica knocked on my door around noon, carrying coffee cups and wearing the satisfied expression that meant she had just completed a successful client presentation. Nike wants to expand the Emerging Athletes program into international markets, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. They're specifically interested in our data localization capabilities for analyzing cultural differences in sports marketing across different countries. The request represented exactly the kind of complex challenge that required our integrated approach to succeed. Jessica's creative vision would be essential for developing culturally sensitive storytelling strategies, while my technical systems would be necessary for analyzing performance metrics across different languages and cultural contexts. Neither of us could handle the project independently, but together we could deliver solutions that larger agencies with traditional departmental structures couldn't replicate. International expansion would require significant investment in translation, services, and cultural research capabilities, I noted, already beginning to calculate implementation logistics and resource requirements. But the profit margins for specialized international marketing services are substantial enough to justify the development costs. Jessica nodded, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm that meant she was already envisioning creative possibilities. "I've been thinking," Jessica said, sipping her coffee while staring out the windows at the Portland skyline, "about something Elena mentioned during your meeting this morning. She said our story had become a template for other women facing similar challenges." She turned back toward me, her expression thoughtful. "I think we should consider writing a book about our experience and the methodology we've developed." The suggestion surprised me, though it made sense given the number of speaking requests we received and the consistent interest in our collaborative approach. "A business book about partnership development and intellectual property protection?" I asked. Jessica shook her head. "Something broader than that. A book about how women can protect their professional contributions while building collaborative relationships that enhance rather than compromise their individual expertise." The idea had immediate appeal. Our story touched on themes that extended beyond family business succession to include gender equity, professional recognition, and collaborative innovation. A book could reach audiences that our consulting services and speaking engagements couldn't access, while establishing our methodology as a recognized framework for addressing similar challenges. We could structure it around the legal protections you developed, but focus on the relationship dynamics and professional development aspects, Jessica continued, warming to the concept as she outlined potential chapters and target audiences. Women starting businesses with romantic partners, daughters joining family companies, professionals in male-dominated industries where their expertise might be undervalued. The book project represented another evolution of our partnership, extending our collaborative approach into publishing and thought leadership. Like every major project we had undertaken together, it would require both of our skill sets to succeed. Jessica's storytelling abilities would be essential for making our experience accessible and engaging, while my analytical perspective would be necessary for developing practical frameworks that readers could implement in their own situations. I think, I said, already beginning to envision research requirements and publishing timelines, that this might be the most important project we've ever considered, not because of potential revenue or professional recognition, but because it could help other women avoid the conflicts we experienced while developing the protective strategies they need to ensure fair treatment. Jessica smiled, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. To the clause they never read, she said, and everything it taught us about protecting what we build. I raised my own cup, thinking about the legal protections that had started as paranoid preparation for theoretical scenarios and evolved into the foundation for professional success that honored everyone's contributions. The business we had, fought to control, had become the platform for achievements that exceeded our individual capabilities. The family conflict that had nearly destroyed our relationships had forced us to develop collaboration skills that made us more effective together than either of us could be alone. The intellectual property protections that had seemed like defensive measures had created opportunities for collaborative innovation that benefited everyone involved. Sometimes the most important legal documents are the ones that protect your right to be valued for what you actually contribute rather than what other people assume you should accept. The clause they never read had ensured that my expertise would be recognized, my contributions would be compensated, and my professional identity would be honored regardless of family dynamics or traditional expectations about hierarchy and recognition. The story of how my parents gave my sister the company I built had become the story of how legal protections forced us to create something better than any of us had originally imagined. The business I had defended through intellectual property, law had evolved into collaborative innovation that proved forced partnerships could become voluntary cooperation when legal frameworks protected everyone's essential contributions. Looking across the office space where our team worked on projects that integrated creative vision with technical precision, I could see the future we had built from the foundation of that devastating Wednesday afternoon meeting. The clause they never read had protected more than my individual rights. It had protected the possibility of collaboration based on mutual respect, rather than traditional assumptions about whose contributions deserved recognition and whose expertise could be taken for granted. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.